Tonight, hundreds of thousands across southern Ukraine are without heat, water, and electricity as Russia continues its attacks on infrastructure in the country. The UN says the humanitarian situation is dire and critical, although electricity supply is gradually being restored. One photographer captured just how ominous the situation is at a children's hospital in Kherson. He says some nurses are working 48 to 72-hour shifts, often using the light from a lamp or flashlights. Nurses are caring for orphan babies and children almost completely in the dark. And in this photo, a doctor tends to a 4-day-old baby under the light of just a desk lamp that's in the children's ICU. Meantime, over the weekend, the head of Ukraine's nuclear agency provider said Russian forces may be planning to leave the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That's Europe's largest nuclear power facility. It provided up to 20% of the country's electricity before the invasion. Joining me now in the city of Zaporizhzhia is CNN's Sam Kiley. And Sam, I want to talk about the nuclear power plant in just a moment. But first, the situation in that hospital in Kherson, it seems dire. And Russia has continued to strike at the city, which they recently pulled out of. What's the status?
Well, ironically, the situation is dire at the hospital in terms of the power supply, but it's better than it was a few days ago because, in fact, Kherson has nearly got 20% power restored to it because the Russians not only destroyed the local power station, but also destroyed the lines connecting it to the rest of the country's network. The network, as you rightly point out there, that itself has been under pressure nationwide, right across the country, as a result of what the Ukrainian government, John says, have been 7 different waves of attacks by predominantly cruise missiles fired by Russia. And just in the last 24 hours, President Zelensky has been warning his population to heed air raid sirens because as far as Ukraine is concerned, they have intelligence that there is likely to be another wave of attacks against the power infrastructure. John?
And what about the power plant, the nuclear power plant? Who is in control of it? How much longer will the Russians stay? What do we actually know for sure?
Well, this has been a very real location in terms of a military strategic necessity or victory, really, for the Russians who captured it back in March. They've been lately, the head of the Ukrainian nuclear industry, who's in touch with people in the neighboring town, has suggested, although provided very little evidence for the suggestion, that the Russians may be preparing to withdraw. But he admits that it doesn't appear to be particularly imminent. I think this should probably be seen as part of the ongoing psychological warfare to go alongside the hot war, because the nuclear power plant, as you rightly point out, provides at its peak 20% of the generating capacity for the whole Ukrainian electrical industry, an industry that the Russians have been trying to systematically destroy. So they're very unlikely to give that up. On top of that, John, it's a very important location in terms of if the Russians pulled out, the Ukrainians would move back in. That would give them a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnipro River to continue their campaign, which in all probability they're likely to do over the next few weeks, perhaps in the Zaporizhzhia front line, which really has been frozen for the last 6 months. So the status of the nuclear power station remains extremely tenuous, though, with the UN observers still there, regularly reporting that they see the evidence of shelling and the results of shelling, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians blame each other for in that very, very tense and dangerous location. John?
All right, Sam Kiley in Zaporizhzhia. Sam, stay safe. Thank you so much. Joining me now with more is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired General Wesley Clark. He's now a senior fellow at UCLA Burkle Center and CNN military analyst. General, nice to see you this evening. We've seen Russia continue to carry out these huge missile strikes, drone attacks across Ukraine. How long could Russia keep up this level of intensity?
Probably several weeks more, maybe longer. We know that they're drawing down their inventories. We know they can't produce the most modern missiles, but they've got old stuff that can be thrown at the Ukrainians. They're apparently now taking nuclear warheads off some of their missiles and just lobbing them in there, either as decoys or letting the metal speak for itself when it hits the ground. So they're going to keep this up for as long as they can. This is the Russian strategy. They can't win on the battlefield. Maybe they can pummel the Ukrainian people into demanding a ceasefire to get their grid restored, and that's what Putin wants. He wants the fighting to stop. wants some sanctions relief, wants to rebuild that military so he can kick this thing into high gear again and finish his mission of taking over Ukraine.
You say the Russians can't win in the battlefield. They're trying to win in at least one city in the Donetsk region in the east, Bakhmut. The Russians claim that they're encircling this city, but the Ukrainians say they are defending it even as Russia tries to throw more forces at it. What do you think the Russians are trying to get out of this very focused, what they claim to be offensive on this city?
Well, look, the way you operate in the military is you do have to focus your combat power. So they are focusing it on this point. And if they take Bakhmut, it does open the door toward Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, but it also serves as a sort of killing ground for grinding up the Ukrainian forces. And this is what they want to do. If they can put unbearable pressure on these Ukrainian forces before they can bring the other forces back from Kherson to bear, if they can cause the Ukrainians to blink, to request a ceasefire, to ask for a breathing spell, Putin wins. So he's got a place where the Ukrainians do have to hold. They are dug in, they are holding, but they're taking heavy losses. So it's a meat grinder.
The temperatures have fallen below freezing in some parts of Ukraine, and it's only going to get colder. What does the onset of winter mean for both armies?
Well, traditionally, it means that you can maneuver off-road. You can still maneuver on road right now. You can still send infantry forward. You can still fight in these built-up areas. So we shouldn't make too much of this. In the 1940s, Ukraine didn't have paved roads, and so the mud was a real problem, but there's a lot of paved roads there now. So yes, it's a problem for off-road maneuver. But the other thing we saw, at least last winter, and I watched the temperature all December, January, and February, the ground never really froze well, especially in the southern area. You might have a day or two below freezing. You'd have 35, 40-degree weather. You'd have snow mixed with rain. So it wasn't like the hard freezes of 40, 50 years ago, where the temperature was 20 degrees and below for weeks on end. That could happen this winter, but it certainly didn't happen last year. If it does, then yes, there'll be a lot of opportunity for widespread maneuver if the Russians have the forces to do it.
Aside from that, for the Ukrainians, what's the best opportunity for them to push their offensive or counteroffensive, as the case may be?
They need to work reconnaissance-led attacks. They need to get across the Dnieper. They need to move into Crimea. Crimea is the sweet spot. If you can move south of Zaporizhia, if you can take Melitopol, combine it with partisan actions, get your special forces in there, do your reconnaissance-led strikes with the HIMARS, you can push that Russian force back into Crimea, threaten Crimea, cut off the supply line that runs along the Sea of Azov. You've got a winning hand there. The Donbass is maybe important in the old terms for political reasons, but the supply lines run along the Sea of Azov, and the sensitive territory is Crimea. And that's where I believe the Ukrainians are headed.
General Wesley Clark, thank you so much for helping us out tonight.